Long have I hunted the forces of mindless entertainment. Sometimes it feels like my strength is fading. Sometimes I feel thin, sort of stretched like butter scraped over too much bread.
I feel it too. Yet there are whispers of a dark world tunneling underneath our feet, deep within the narrative. I fear if we do not continue to engage media from a godly worldview, we will fade from this land.
This is why we have forged the podcast, a weapon, a power not over the flesh, but over the spirit.
But two cannot wield it alone. We need a third.
Who? Who would claim such an arduous quest?
The patron saints of popcorn theology. And I have found, among them, a champion, a popcorn theologian, who would risk touching the darkness in order to find the light. I just pray it is not too late.
In a world where entertainment is viewed as mindless diversion, only good for momentary distraction, one podcast has taken a stand, thoughtfully engaging the art of our day, dissecting the narrative, and pointing the people back to the greatest storyteller of all. You are about to enter a new world, and you will never view entertainment in the same way again. This is Popcorn Theology.
Welcome, movie lovers and theology nerds, to episode 276 of Popcorn Theology. I'm David.
And I'm Miles, and we're introducing our popcorn theologian, our champion, Eric George. Welcome to the podcast, Eric.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, Eric, you kind of came to our rescue this week because David and I are admittedly not really Tolkien experts. We have kind of a surface level understanding. And some of you popcorn theologians really came in with a little bit of extra knowledge and insight. And so we asked you to join, and we've liked your notes on the Facebook page and Discord page. And so welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your popcorn theology experience and history?
Yeah, so I've been a longtime fan of pre-episode 100. I've listened to, I know, it's a long time. I've listened to every single episode.
Oh, wow.
I've referred this podcast to many people. Several of your Patreon's supporters or people that I've gone to church with talked about this podcast for years. So yeah, this is kind of my experience with it. Like I said, I believe I've listened to every single episode. Wow. Maybe one or two here that I missed. But yeah, it's been an enjoyable ride.
That's awesome. I will say this. If you've listened to every episode, then you've listened to more episodes than either Richard or I, because there are episodes I'm not on that I haven't listened to, even though I did some of the editing. Richard had some that he hadn't listened to because he hadn't seen the movie and whatnot. And so, yeah, it's I think my brother has listened to most of them, and maybe a couple other folks have gotten pretty close. So even the people who make the podcast haven't listened to all of them individually. So that's quite an honor. Thank you. And I want to mention as well that having another Eric on is really cool because we've had a couple Erics on in the past, and I think they were all spelled E-R-I-C, if I'm not mistaken. Eric Skorsinski and Eric, oh crud, I'm going to forget his last name. I forget his last name. Anyway, he joined us for the Making a Murderer episode.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it's going to bug me. I'll look it up. Anyway.
But 276 episodes, that means Eric is dedicated, and he's helped us write our notes in the past.
Yes, yeah. For sure. He's made an appearance. And honestly, like that's kind of how things were with Miles. Eventually, it was like, we're saying this guy's name a lot in the episode. We may as well see what he has to say. And so, but additionally, one reason that we're getting to this now is just because of, circumstances, other episodes to come out. We definitely didn't get to this one quite as promptly as maybe we could have, but that's okay. We had Patreon episodes to drop and everything. But also, when we did drop the episode on the first two I guess when we dropped our episode on the first 2 Rings of Power episodes, there were a number of times when Miles, James, and myself would just be like, yeah, well, I haven't read the Silmarillion, so I don't really know this or that. As much as we love Tolkien, we're kind of, I would say we're armchair Tolkien fans. And I would wager, Eric, that you're a little bit more serious about it than we are. Is that true?
Yeah, that's very true. I've read, so I am not a Tolkien expert. I'm a Lord of the Rings super fan, if you want to put it that way. So I haven't read all of Tolkien's other works. I've read the Lord of the Rings trilogy over a dozen times. For a while, I would read it every single fall. I've studied the appendices. I've studied the Silmarillion multiple times. I read the Silmarillion about 6 months ago. Babylon Bee podcast, they went through, for subscribers of their platform, they went through the entirety of the Lord of the Rings in podcast form, each chapter. Wow. And so I followed along with that, went through it again with them, learned some more of the background of what it was that Tolkien was trying to accomplish with his, essentially creating his mythos that he did. I also, before we get started, I do want to also thank Maddie, because Maddie has also awesome notes that she was able to provide for you last time. And she was invited to come on and talk with you guys, but she decided to let me go ahead and do it instead. So I just want to thank Maddie. It was a tremendous honor to come on, and I know she would have loved to be on here as well.
Yeah, and diving into this series itself, is I've found personally that ignorance appears to be bliss with this show. Because really at the level that I've experienced, I've read Lord of the Rings one time, read The Hobbit one time, watched the movies a few times, and this show seems to be aimed right at me, because I found myself generally liking it. It fits kind of within the themes that were brought through in the movies. And I run in a lot of the circles where people were really, really salty about this movie, but I just couldn't help but like it. And then I think in our last podcast, I talked about, if this seems more like, people have been describing it as maybe a love letter to Tolkien. I was like, it seems more like a love letter maybe to the Peter Jackson movies. And I was like, maybe somebody has more depth, they have issues with it, but I really like it. And then both Maddie and Eric in our social media spaces were like, here is exactly why you should be upset. And it kind of reminded me, like, I'm a pretty big Batman fan. I mean, who isn't? But there are times in which a good Batman movie or show comes out where people seem to really enjoy it. Or maybe like Thor. It's like, this movie was entertaining, but I felt like it betrayed the character of Thor. And I just find that seems to be the difference between people's interactions. And one of the main reasons why we invited both you and Maddie on this week was that I liked it, but I was like, it might actually be really worthwhile to get somebody's informed, salty opinion. Not just hating for haters' sake, but some informed salt. But we could start with a little bit of, like, I liked almost all of it. I found myself just genuinely enjoying it. Let's start with some positives. What did you like about it, Eric?
We're going to make you be positive for a moment. Go for it.
I'm going to keep my inner critical drinker to a very minimum for this podcast. I liked the music. I thought the music was great. Friend of mine who's goes to my church, musician, loves it. He had it on in the background, so I asked him, I was like, "Hey, what'd you think of it?" And he absolutely loved the music. The visuals were spectacular. I mean, you could tell the $600 million they spent. You could see it on screen on the special effects. Practical effects, not quite as much. But in all honesty, that's kind of all I liked about it. The other stuff that I'll have in my comments here that I was able to pull from it, that's, to me, is like, that's the like when you're eating barbecue ribs and you get done with you've eaten the actual meal and you just pick up the bone and just chew on the bone, and like that flavor. To me, that was like the analogy I'm using. Is like I was just only chewing on bones and kind of getting that flavor. And that's kind of the ideas I'll be getting out of this today.
Fair enough. Yeah. And as to your point, I agree. The visuals were stunning. I thought that was, I'm very much the type to not emphasize visuals as much when I watch films or TV shows. I'm one to watch it on my laptop or my phone if I have to. But for this show, I went out of my way to make sure that I watched every episode, at least the first run through, on the big screen TV, pretty good size screen TV that we have, just to try and really soak in the visuals. And I appreciated that. I agree that it felt like visually it was definitely a spectacle. And as we'll talk about a bit more in a moment, I think that some of those lessons were learned the hard way from some of the mistakes of the Hobbit trilogy. And so I appreciated some of the corrections that they made visually. The music was great. I think that the story was it was, I think, a mixed bag, in my opinion. As somebody who is, loves the Lord of the Rings films and has read the books once, kind of like Miles, read the books once. I was familiar with the character, with the races and with the history, just very vaguely. And so I didn't have a lot of gripes with it, but again, mostly based out of that ignorance. And so I think that's good that we have those opinions, because not every viewer certainly is going to have that same background in terms of being familiar with the books. But regardless, as with anything, there's always going to be something to draw out thematically, and so that's why I'm excited to get into this.
Oh yeah, we got plenty of that. We got plenty of that. But the visual. Every couple of episodes, there was a shot that was just beautiful. That if there wasn't the privacy protections that have been put in place in Prime, I would have some screenshots. But I'll have to figure out somebody on. But just like there's a shot between certain monsters and heroes, or that were just so good in the first couple episodes. The Nazgul and the eagle fighting was awesome, and then there was one between a Balrog and an elf fighting that was just awesome and completely epic. And it was like, okay, thank you, Amazon. You're the only one who would spend the money to produce a visual like this.
And we get to reap the rewards of some of that. As another quick aside, I will mention that we're going to just drop a spoiler warning right now. We can't really go too much further.
Sorry, guys.
No, you're good. That's fine. There wasn't really any content there, I don't think. Nothing really significant. But we're talking here about the content of the film, or excuse me, not film. Excuse me, the show. And so. Yeah, just if you haven't seen it and you're worried about spoilers, don't listen any further. Go check it out and then come back. If you're not worried about spoilers, whatever.
And
apparently
if you're
some
sensitive,
of our listeners do that.
If you're sensitive, it appears that no horses were killed in the making of this 8-hour epic. Did you guys notice that scene?
Yeah,
it was weird. It was really took me out of it. I was like, wait. Yeah. I actually was watching with my wife, and it happened. I was like, oh, poor horse. And then they made sure you see the horse get up and walk away. I was like, what?
What is this?
Yeah, that was worth a couple seconds for some reason. I agree. That was odd. Yeah, especially because some horses must have died moments before.
Yeah. Or for example,
I guess moments after. Yeah.
You know that big Braveheart sword that he carries? The claymores? You know what those were originally designed to do? It wasn't really to fight other people specifically. It was meant to break the legs of horses. That's what those big horses were. Those big swords are for. And it's just so funny. It was I could almost hear a narrator be like, no horses were harmed in the making of this series. It just, in this epic battle, I don't know why. It's funny that we all seem to have noticed that in our notes.
I almost want to cut away and have it be the grandpa from Princess Bride. Now the horse isn't hurt at this time. What? I'm explaining to you because you seem nervous.
And so there were clearly some modern sensibilities that were pressed into the show. Not as much as I thought would be, considering the marketing, but it's one of those things that raises a question. Like with this show, is Tolkien rolling over in his grave?
Yes.
That's why we have you on, Eric.
Yeah, I know. There is no question that Tolkien is rolling over in his grave. He was incredibly protective of his ideas, of his world, and his son Christopher was even more so. So it's one of those things where it's hard to go into, because he had an idea of what his world was supposed to be. His world was supposed to be a mythology for Great Britain, essentially. And that's what he was getting started at. It wasn't about all the things that people try to say it's about. that's why people criticize his story about, oh, it's a simplistic view of good and evil. And I think we'll get into that later. It it was designed to be a mythology of you. There weren't shades of gray because he was creating a world that uh, to give an explanation for why Britain was as great as it was, as you know, that they could look back to, because people that don't know the history of the British Isles is they don't have a unified history. They've been that their our entire language, English, is a derivative of French and German and Latin. And so it's just all these amalgamations. Oh, Scandinavian even. So he was just trying to create this world, this one mythos to be like, hey, we can look back to this and say, hey, we're these types of people.
And so I'm curious, was that a stated goal, or was that something that was sort of intrinsic and explored in terms of like, we think this is what he was doing, or do you know if that was something he stated? Because I've heard people claim that for sure. I'm just curious.
I'd have to look it up exactly, but I mean, some of the interviews that he's had, later on in life, he has said things very close to that. I'm probably paraphrasing a little bit, but yeah, he was purposefully creating a mythology for Great Britain.
Yeah, so it's
okay.
one of those things that we try to draw out in the first Ring of Power episode, is that this Tolkien world is borderline sacred to people, and it touches that level. And so it's funny because it's not particularly sacred to me. The way they're kind of playing with the themes is like, I don't really mind, but it's just one of those things where, yeah, you got to realize that what they're doing with this show is really warping some of the pictures. In particular, like Galadriel's character is changed in some significant ways that feel like a betrayal to some people that I've talked to.
Well, it's not necessarily. Yeah, it's a betrayal. I mean, you can make a warrior woman, warrior princess, whatever. I mean,
Xena.
yeah, I was one of the fans. I was annoyed with Arwen from the first movies. I was like, you don't have to make her, a warrior. You can be powerful without being, without having to pick up a sword, essentially. But it's this modern idea that if you're not actively fighting the battle, therefore you're weak, which was really the story arc of Eowyn. In the first book and the first movie is at the end of the Return of the King, particularly in the book, she comes to that realization that being a woman or being a warrior didn't necessarily mean having to go into battle. It could be these other things. She could submit to a worthy man like Faramir, which the Faramir in the books is so much better than the Faramir in the movies. But kind of to go down this route is, in the notes here you said there's a love letter to Tolkien, but probably better described as a love letter to the Jackson movies. And the way that I would describe this is not inspired by Tolkien. This is not an adaptation of Tolkien. This isn't even a homage to Tolkien. This is something that saw, and this is my cynical side coming out. This is something that saw tremendous marketing potential in the name Lord of the Rings. They went and they robbed the grave of Tolkien. They used the names of his characters for their own stories. And this is worse than any type of fanfic because they now go around flaunting this story as if it was a genuine article. So they may think this is a love letter to Tolkien. They may honestly, sincerely believe they wrote a love letter to Tolkien. But Tolkien and his son Christopher would definitely not receive it as such. And they would have been more critical than some of their harshest critics that they've ever had. And as far as a homage to Jackson's films, as I said, they definitely took certain framings and homages to it. Some of the best scenes and some of the best dialogues are direct calls to Jackson's movies.
Right.
In fact, I think in the notes here, some of the lines are directly from that.
Yeah.
But they're also not in the same spirit as the original trilogy. The original trilogy was in the spirit of the books, and this is something else. This is something completely different. So that's kind of that's my cynical side already coming out. And for the most part, I'm done with the cynical side now. So.
Yeah, we're actually
That's
we're gonna get that out of the way, because one thing that's nice about it, we were talking about this before the episode, is okay, how do we be Christians in the shape of this kind of disagreement, sometimes disappointment, and as our OG Popcorn Theology hosts will always put it, is image bearers are going to bear image, and there is plenty to pull out of this show. In particular, they took seriously the concept of really struggling with good and evil in this show, and that at least touches, I think, some of the heart of why Lord of the Rings connects with people, is that really taking good and evil seriously. Especially, I love the idea in the movies and in the show, just that across all these different regions and all these different races and all these different strengths and weaknesses, people were all struggling against a similar thing. And one of the greatest themes in all of Lord of the Rings is a biblical theme where God uses the weak to shame the strong, uses the those emptied of power in order to defeat the powerful, and then conversely, those who are trying to seize power will end up coming to their own destruction. That's a biblical theme that's woven throughout Tolkien's work, especially the movies and in the show. And I think that there's plenty for us to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely tons. And one thing that I was fascinated by is the reception that people had to this show before it even dropped. Now, admittedly, I wasn't following the news very closely, and so some of it I think was a little lost on me. And as Miles said, sometimes ignorance is kind of bliss at times.
It really is.
But but I was curious, Eric, if there was anything about the reception prior to the release of the show that upon viewing it, you said, okay, that may have been over, like that. Maybe this element wasn't, either it was not warranted criticism or they must have changed something before the release. Like I know there were a lot of concerns that it was going to be like Game of Thrones, and those types of things, or like, you know, for example, some of the woke elements, quote, I'm not a fan of the term, but whatever, woke elements that would be in the story that to me I thought were largely either unfounded or unwarranted once I saw the whole thing, or were at the very least exaggerated, or perhaps, like I said, that they made some changes in response to outrage. And what we ended up getting, at least in my opinion, was a lot more, I don't know, grounded. Certainly had problems, and we'll get into those. But I was curious in your case, Eric, if there was anything that you were perhaps upon the viewing of it saying, okay, that wasn't quite as bad as I was expecting.
So
to counter that cynical side earlier.
Yeah. In all honesty, I didn't follow too much of the pre-release stuff. When it first started, when it was first announced, I was like, oh, this could actually be good. So I was actually, my initial was, could be good. Then I heard about the intimacy coaches, and I'm like, yeah, what are they trying to do with that? I still had hope because I was like, yeah, the Tolkien estate, they hold on to it pretty tightly. I did not know the whole relationship between Simon Tolkien and his dad. If I had known that, then I'd probably been a little bit more cynical. Which, yeah, anyone
I got no idea about that.
Just Google the relationship between Simon Tolkien and Christopher Tolkien, and you'll realize there was a whole falling out 2 decades ago, reconciled, but completely different visions of what to do with J.R.R.'s story. And what directions to go with it.
Gotcha.
So as far as, I didn't really follow it too much when some of this stuff started coming out with the whole thing of like black elves and black dwarves and yada yada, all that type of stuff. I was on the side of, I don't care. I mean, I wasn't upset when they race swapped, quote unquote, Nick Fury. I was like, I didn't care. I didn't care when they race swapped the Kingpin back in the Matt Damon Daredevil movie. I was like,
that was not the worst part. That was the strongest part of that movie, actually.
I'm actually a defender. That movie holds a special place in my heart for some. It's kind of like this show for me. It's a lot of people salty. I kind of like that old Ben Affleck Daredevil movie.
Michael Clark.
Well, this is Miles' last episode on the podcast. I'm just kidding.
No, but
so it's like those elements. I didn't really care. And in all honesty, the only people that had more of an issue with it are the people who understood that this is supposed to be a mythology for Great Britain.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, it creates this awkward thing. It was like, well, let's so there are elves. There were black elves 3,000 years ago, but there's no black elves in the Lord of the Rings present. Like, what
Was there a
happened to
race
all
war
that?
among the elves?
Yeah, it's like
It
what,
does get a
what
little
happened?
awkward if you
Yeah.
consider it in the prequel sense,
But-
in a similar way to like the Star Wars prequels. Like,
Yes.
okay, so and I love seeing people make the memes of like, this is them fighting in the prequels, flying around, and then this is them like 20 years later or 10 years later, or in the case of some of the recent ones, like 6 months later, and they're fighting, and they're like, oh gosh, I definitely had that question. I'm like, okay, so there was a lot more ethnic diversity within all these groups. I'm a little horrified to know what happened between there and the second or the third age or whenever the Lord of the Rings.
And it kind of works with Star Wars. Like when the Empire came, there's this horrific ethnic cleansing that came, or even like I've heard some people talk about Tolkien's universe slowly getting worse and worse and worse in each age. I don't know if most Tolkien scholars or whatever, or the Lord of the Rings scholars would, but there was something about the fading of the light that continues to happen throughout these stories and kind of cycles throughout the Middle Earth history.
So the only way they could go that route is if you tie the quote unquote fading of the light with the supremacy of the elves. So Tolkien had his mythology set up in multiple ages. Fourth age technically starts, depending on again, controversy.
What age
Tolkien
did the
circles.
movies take place in?
So the movies took place at literally the end of the third age. So the fourth age either starts at Aragorn's coronation or Elrond leaving Middle Earth. Those are kind of like the two agreed upon when the fourth age starts. And we, again, taking Tolkien's mythology, we would technically be living in the fourth age of it. So first age, creation of the world, of Middle Earth, which was actually flat at the time, which is just kind of funny. It is funny mythology. It is really awesome mythology. But it's creating the world. The elves, wake up. They're the firstborn or first awakened of creation. Some stay in Middle Earth. Some go to Valinor, live in Valinor for countless thousands of years. No one knows how long. Morgoth comes, destroys the trees. All of that's covered very well in the Silmarillion. That's roughly when the second the elves then leave Valinor in a conquest to go fight Morgoth. They eventually defeat him at the end of actually Elrond's dad. Takes the last remaining Silmaril, sails across the ocean to Valinor, convinces the gods to intervene on their behalf. That's called the War of Wrath. So that's the battle that you see in the first episode of with the eagle and the Nazgul creature. That's the final battle in the War of Wrath. They go and they and that's the end of the first age. And the second age spans the creation of Numenor all the way to, I think the second age ends with the destruction of Numenor.
So this show is supposed to take someplace in there in the second age, even though I know that you're
so
audible
the second
sigh,
age is
audible
like 2,500 years, and they're condensing it to a very short amount of time.
Which, with the speaking of the Silmarils, is that James and I were both half right about what was in the box at the end of episode 2. I thought it was a Silmaril. He thought it was Mithril, and then apparently. No, nice. You got a box.
I've got. So I have the actual box because I ordered something from Amazon. And it showed up and it was in the little box, and I was like, so I kept it. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I'm a sucker for this kind of thing. Mine had like probably a water wow in it or some kid's toy.
But you don't have.
I remember thinking Mithril, and you guys were saying somewhere else, and I was like, man, I wonder if it's.
Turns out we were both right. Awesome, both but it's another one of those things. It's probably
Eric
a good example.
Is visibly pained right now.
Yeah, he's shaking his head. He's like, that's not that doesn't work that way. That doesn't Superman can't take away somebody's memory with a kiss. that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
anyone that knows anything about Tolkien lore it has to be shaking their head. I mean, yeah, it's like you if you guys really wanted the cynical perspective, you should have had my wife on. She would have.
You guys seem equally yoked. That's great.
Yeah,
A
when it
real
comes to Lord of the
Durin
Rings,
and
absolutely.
Disa kind of couple. But yeah, so that's all the mythos to kind of build up that there is some depth to this universe. But we will be talking
Yes.
mainly about this show as this show. And so coming up, we'll drop the ad break and remind all you guys to like, share, subscribe the episode. And if you're the type of person that likes to help us with your notes, you might be able to work your way onto the podcast someday. Both Eric and I did it. You can do it too.
This is a hostile takeover. I feel I'm outnumbered.
Yeah.
This is getting out of hand. There are two of them.
We've been taking them down. And pretty soon we will make this our homeland. We will blot out the sun, and there will be a place.
Oh gosh.
Using a ton of different franchises, just throwing all the quotes in. Yeah.
We don't have Miles. You're gonna have to be careful. We don't have them. We can't afford all these quotes. We don't have the rights.
We don't have the rights. Oh yeah, man. If somebody peeked through our podcast between all the songs and stuff that we take, we're just floating under the radar.
Why do you think we're not on YouTube? No, I'm just kidding.
But yeah,
we are working on that. Speaking of promotion stuff.
Oh yeah.
Check us out on YouTube. If we don't get taken off for copyright infringement, then we should be on YouTube at some point and dropping whole episodes and dropping clips and things like that. And as Miles mentioned, give it a like, share, subscribe, share it on whatever social media you're involved in, and keep the conversation going with people. We're not at the end yet. I know
that's normally how we end it.
Yeah. Well, Eric, it was great having you on and hearing all your negativity, but we're done now. No.
Oh, it gets a lot better from here. This is going to be good.
It's going to be great. I'm excited about it. So definitely do those things. And, we haven't plugged this in a while, but Christmas is coming up. So check out the merch store. Perhaps there's a popcorn theologian in your life who, really would like a sticker or a coffee mug or a T-shirt or a hoodie or all of the above. So check out the merch store. That is linked through in the show notes. You can find a link for that. And so join us here after the break, and we'll talk a little bit more about Rings of Power Season 1.
This episode of Popcorn Theology is brought to you by Missionalware. Missionalware has a large selection of high-quality apparel, drinkware, art, and more, all from a Reformed Christian perspective. Check out missionalware.com and tell them Popcorn Theology sent you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Popcorn Theology. If you want to hear more from us, subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast catcher.
Also, follow us on Facebook and Twitter and share this episode with your friends.
Assuming you have friends. To sponsor more content like this, consider supporting Popcorn Theology through Patreon. Then you'll make some friends.
For just $1 a month, you can have friends. You can become a patron saint and be added to our exclusive Facebook group, where you can interact, influence, and vote on future episodes of the podcast.
Well, let's get back to the episode.
Sing to me, lands far away. Oh, rise up and guide me this wandering day. Please promise to find me this wandering day. At last comes their answer.
Okay, and we are back. Let's get in a little bit of theology, a little bit deeper, and explore some of the themes of episodes 3 through 8 of Rings of Power Season 1. And just to remind us of our first episode, this is the first time we've done a two-parter on a season of a show. And I'm kind of glad we did, because there were a lot of themes in the first 2 episodes. And some of them were brought forward. But just as a reminder, I think our first big theme in that show was that evil never sleeps. That's what Galadriel is all about, is being ever vigilant. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, when I was watching this, and again, by the third episode, I was like, all right, I have to just watch this on its own merit. I can't keep comparing it to Tolkien. But that was one of the first episode. I was like, wow, Galadriel's she's a very driven person, and she's just not letting this go. And it reminded me in Jeremiah where it says, beware those who say peace, peace, when there is no peace.
Yeah.
I was like, that is the perfect, Gilgalad, and it turns out he knew Sauron was still out there, but he was trying to say peace. just so that Galadriel would just calm down. He's trying to appease the gods, and it was like that's not how you go about this.
Yeah.
So again, that evil doesn't sleep; it just waits.
Which
and
is
beware those who want you to sleep while evil's waiting.
Yeah, and that's the thing
Yeah.
that drives Galadriel forward in this show, which makes her big choice in the first 2 episodes of this show was whether she should basically be willing to depart for what is effectively heaven for the elves, or to stay in Middle Earth and continue her quest to fight evil, which reminded me of Paul saying, to live is Christ, to die is gain. You know, to live as a Christian is to continually be fighting to spread the gospel, to turn people to repentance, to rebuke and encourage, all those kind of arduous things. But to die, I get to be with Christ. And Galadriel makes a similar choice there that was pretty commendable and reminded me of a Christian's drive to fight the good fight of faith and not just be, I got my ticket to heaven, let's go.
Yeah, for sure.
And then there's also huge things in this show, which I really loved. One of the best, most low-hanging fruit of the original Lord of the Rings movies was the friendship between Legolas and Gimli. That was, as a early teen watching that movie, it was one of the few things where I really understood, oh, there's something really deep here. You know, I never thought I'd die side by side with an elf. How about side by side with a friend? And this show does a very similar thing between Elrond and Durin. Friendship, honor, and the temptation and the struggle of deception between nations and the friendship between 2 men was just one of the most positive things in this show. It was just a good example of how do you be really loyal to a friend while trying to fulfill your duty as an elf or a dwarf.
For sure. I mean, that's one thing that I thought this show did quite well. And first of all, as I mentioned in the first in our previous episode on this, it's really cool to actually see the dwarves like, you know, at their peak in some ways. You know, we get to see their kingdom of Khazad-dûm. We get to see them not having just been destroyed, which is pretty much the only way we've encountered more than a dozen dwarves at a time up until this point. Is nothing goes well for them. They just can't catch a break. But in this case, we get to see them, you know, before they can't catch a break. And you know, the character of Elrond in particular is just, I thought, was really well handled in this show. As much as Galadriel to me was really hit or miss in terms of like virtue and some of the kind of cringier elements of how she delivered some of the character arcs, I really thought that Elrond was just knocked it out of the park, in my opinion. Again,
yeah, in one word, he was
ignorance being bliss of what his character was maybe supposed to be doing. I thought this was a really virtuous, likable character in the show.
Yeah, he was honorable. He was honorable in his friendship and in his duty to his nation. And that was, it was really commendable in terms of something to receive from the show. If Game of Thrones is about how everybody is corrupt and abuses power and twists it, this show actually tried to ground honorable conduct in a messy world. And that was fun to watch.
Yeah, that's one of the things I got out of Elrond's arc as well. Is I forget which episode it was where he just given an oath to Durin, and he's with the king, and the king's describing the dire situation that the elves are in, and Elrond won't break his oath to his friend.
Right.
I was like, that we just need more of that. I was like, he's the Ned Stark. If we're talking about Game of Thrones, he's the Ned Stark who, you know, spoiler alert, doesn't get killed. You know.
Yeah, and in this show, the elves are at the mercy of the dwarves, and still Elrond is loyal to Durin, even though he's not ignorantly loyal. He knows what's at stake and is trying to figure out a way to solve the problem. But it reminded me of Proverbs 18:24. You know, a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. These guys were friends that stuck closer than brothers, and I thought that was pretty awesome, which wrapped their character arc, I think, is one of the best examples of a theme I thought was in the rest of the show, was just simply, you help me, I help you, which transitions also into the Harfoots, you know? So little Nuri, I think, you know, Nuri is Frodo and Bobby is Samwise. if they're basically
Yeah.
remaking characters, right? And little Nuri.
I'll say this for all of the Lord of the Rings fans: how dare you?
I have some questions.
That's why we have
First
you.
question. Yeah.
Because it's very obvious that that's what they're trying to do, but also how
Yep.
dare you?
It was, and it was.
Yeah.
They were definitely like, you're trying really hard to make me believe that that's what's happening here. And as much as I wanted to like this show, honestly, as we got towards the end of the show, and I'm the one who was trying really hard to be optimistic. I really was. And overall, I enjoyed a lot of it, but it didn't age as well. Like the more I thought about it, and then I went back and did a rewatch of the whole season. And upon the rewatch, I was just like, yeah, it was a mixed bag. There was some good stuff and there was some rough stuff. And to me, Nori's character was okay, but the fact that they're so clearly trying to get us to be emotionally invested in them, I just struggled with. I thought the Stranger arc was okay, but really the Nori Poppy thing and most of the Harfoot subplot was just kind of messy. I don't know. I don't know how else to say it. It was inconsistent. Are they a loving community that cares for each other, or are they very much like, eat your own kind of thing?
Yeah, or are they a bunch of sociopaths who who preach one thing and then literally an hour later are doing the exact opposite?
And if they didn't preach it, it wouldn't be so bad. Yeah,
exactly.
And boy, oh boy, is that a good lesson in this show. They're walking around saying nobody goes off trail, nobody walks alone. We'll wait for you. And then, as Eric pointed out, the next scene, this guy with the broken foot is like, put him in the back. It's like that old-fashioned, I don't have to outrun the bear, I have to outrun you kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. So someone put in here, I think it was actually Becky that put in here, but the greater good mindset from the Hot Fuzz.
The greater good.
Yeah. It's like they're protecting their own. They're making sure that the community survives. And what does that mean? The weak have to be in the back.
I mean, and there's a way that can be handled more virtuously. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, right? I mean, so it's not exactly like that's a completely out of place concept in every case. But for this to be the Harfoots are presumably ancestral to the hobbits, and the hobbits are the creatures of such simplicity and I guess innocence that they're able to be uncorrupted by the ring to the degree that less corrupted by the ring, I suppose, if I'm understanding that correctly, Eric.
Yes.
And so for the Harfoots here, I don't really get that same level of that kind of simple innocence that we get with the hobbits of the Third Age. So it's fascinating the way that they went with that, and then also just I don't know, they definitely. Just the very clear inconsistency of like, here's all the people that we left behind. Some of them like died in a rock slide. Well, that's unfortunate. Like, there's not much you can do there. But the ones that they were sick and we left. I would like to think that there's an extended cut of that clip where it's like, so and so had a cold, and a bad splinter, and we left them behind. That kind of thing.
It was a strange mix. Like, there were these beautiful moments. One of my favorite scenes was, I think it was Bobby singing a song.
I think it was Poppy. Wasn't her name Poppy?
Poppy? Yeah.
Hi, Poppy. Yeah.
That was another
thing. They're all named after flowers, which was a little unoriginal after like the fourth flower name. But anyway.
I didn't even catch that. But anyway, she's like singing this. It basically sounded like a psalm that was a description of salvation history or of, cultural history. In this season we go here, in this season we go here, and these are the principles we live by. Kind of reminded me of like a song of ascent. This is a song that we sing as we're going up to Jerusalem each year, that kind of thing. But there's this, it's strange. Their philosophy seems to be contradicted by their practice. Do we really, nobody walks along, we'll wait for you. But in this show, it seemed like Nori actually kind of lived out their law, or the spirit of the law, maybe not the letter of the law, by helping the stranger. And in the end, there's like this lesson borne out, I help you, you help me. Not as like mercenary, but as genuine community.
And I think so. And the way that it's going to be, this is my wife's theory anyways, I don't have any proof, it's going to be Gandalf. It's going to turn out that is Gandalf, which again breaks all the Tolkien lore, which is they spend a lot of money so they can do that.
You bought the lore.
But but that's going to come full circle. It's like, because the Harfoots helped Gandalf all the way back in the day when he first came to Middle Earth, is now, that's what basically gives him an affinity to the hobbits, which then eventually leads to the complete destruction of, of Sauron. But when I saw that scene where it was like, all right, back of the line after the the "we wait for you" scene, it made me think of in James, because I just finished reading the book of James while I was going through the show. And it says, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? And it just made me long for an actual community that believes that we wait for you. That when I'm injured, they come, they help me with my cart. The stranger, Nori's family would have died if the stranger hadn't been there to be able to, help push the cart along.
And so, yeah, narratively, it's like a rebuke of that community being harsher than they need to be, because when Nori shows some love for the stranger, not just speaking to being compassionate, she actually shows it. That's the key to their salvation as a group of people in the show, which is a cool way narratively to portray that characteristic. Similarly, you have that kind of among nations between Numenor and the sea and the Southlands. There's a lot of pressure that goes into it, but eventually Numenor sends ships and soldiers to go into the Southland to help a country that they don't really need too much, right? They haven't been in contact with the Southlands for a long time, barely even any trade. But between Galadriel and Halbrand, they lead a charge to go save another nation. You help me, we help you.
The Southlands call for aid.
Yeah, it's
and Numenor will answer. Yeah,
that's exactly why I thought this show was kind of a love letter to those movies, is because there's these points where the struggles are kind of fractured among the Rings of Power groups. The same kind of struggles that people had in the Lord of the Rings movies are played over again in this show, kind of the way I think the Force Awakens was playing with the themes of the first movie, where it's like of the first Star Wars. It was kind of a similar kind of thing where you're like, okay, some people may not like this, but it is revisiting the same themes in an interesting way.
And I was along that same line. I wanted to circle back to that idea of comparing Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, because there's people comparing the fandoms right now. And I think maybe at times there's some similarities.
We're more well-read.
We got more pages.
Well, everything in the book, all the books are canon, and that's the difference, right? Instead of in Star Wars. But like for me, what I thought was fascinating is that, if you draw the comparison of like, okay, the original trilogy, Star Wars, is basically the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? Lightning in a bottle, incredibly well executed, beautiful, classics. Then you get prequels, right? The Hobbit trilogy, the Star Wars prequels, and weaknesses, extra stuff, narratively messy, visually strange, way too much CGI, added characters, a lot of similarities there between the prequels. Then you get an attempt several years later at sequel trilogies, right? And so in this case, it's a series, but in the case of the Star Wars universe, it's the episodes 7, 8, and 9. And what I think, and this goes back more to the Star Wars episodes, is that those episodes learned from the mistakes of the prequels. And then they made their own mistakes, because that's going to happen. But they at least visually rounded out the world in a much better way than the prequels did. And narratively, they at least attempted to avoid some of those same pitfalls. And I think that the Lord of the Rings of Power series is sort of similar in that sense. We don't get weird CGI orcs. We get pretty good practical effects on the orcs. The orcs look great. We don't get, for no reason, they're speaking Orcish now instead of Common Tongue. We don't have that random element thrown in there. But in visually overall, they knocked it out of the park, as we mentioned earlier. But narratively, as with the Star Wars sequels, just like Miles just mentioned, they play with the same themes, and they're really trying to recapture it. And, the problem is that in this case, it's not really a sequel. It's just taking place later. It was set earlier, and it's actually building on lore that existed in the books. And that's where Star Wars fans can be frustrated all they want, but really, this is a fictional story about space wizards that somebody wrote for the movies. Yeah, there's books, but the books aren't considered to be necessarily all canon. And so, to me,
people are like,
there's a
but
lot
darn
of
it, it's
similarities there.
meaningful to me, And that,
Yeah.
I mean, we've done 276 episodes of a podcast basically communicating that idea. And so, like, one thing in this show is I love that they take a good old-fashioned attempt to deal with the internal struggles with evil and the desire for personal and corporate redemption. Like there's this interaction between Galadriel and Theo, which was a part of the man and elf. That was another part of this show that I forgot, another story arc where you have Bronwyn and Arondir, the human woman and the elf that was been over the Southlands. So he's been kind of like Galadriel, vigilant for evil this whole time. Meanwhile, falling in love with a person, as well as the struggles that seem to be in that story arc seem to be a little more human, a little more modern, in which the humans seem to just kind of resent the elves who are watching over them. It was an interesting story arc. Although by the end of the show, like when we were writing our notes, I realized that I could kind of take that whole piece out, most of it out, without having it be essential to the show. But it was kind of interesting.
Yeah. The same with some of the Harfoot stuff. It was like you really were trying to go somewhere with it, but really this whole story arc surrounding Galadriel, like you were trying to keep these separate things going. I think if they had joined them sooner in the story, then things would probably have been narratively a little more straightforward and clean and made more sense. But by the time Arondir and Bronwyn get caught up with everyone else, they're just kind of background characters at that point.
Which is interesting because like I put this in my notes is that's actually like the one storyline I was most interested in. It went nowhere. I was like, no, I want to see how they're gonna go here with the he's the elf, and the racial animosity that the Southlanders have towards him, and he's engaging in this quasi forbidden relationship, and it just kind of just fizzled out and went nowhere. I was
then in addition to that, the element of they were their overlords basically.
Yes.
And so there's added tension, not just that humans and elves can't be together. It's not just Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's really more like you're selling out to the victors, if you will.
Yeah.
But that whole thing with the Southlanders, I thought was actually kind of what I thought was a pretty interesting theme in terms of the fact that they had this historic. I don't want to say struggle, but they basically had been
they joined
the cowards, for lack of a better word. They had joined the evil one. They were fallen, and so that was like, whoa, that was pretty interesting. And then that residually lived within them as the elves constantly would call down and say, that those are the descendants of those who joined with Morgoth, but really it's the same blood runs in their veins. So that was interesting.
If the writers were as clever as they believe they are. And I believe they think they're very clever because this could have been called the analogies of power. There's like 100 different analogies that they use. Like, it's like Galadriel comes out of the water. It's like, you're as wet as a lily rock. You could have just said, why are you so wet? But it's like, in a way, it's kind of like, depending on how you wanted to do it, this could be Germany post World War I, pre World War II.
Yeah,
they're a group of people that are being justly, unjustly, whichever history books you want to read, saying, "Hey, you put too much pressure on us. You just give us some freedom. Let us be a people again." And the elves keep going, "No," much like France did back in the day. No. You cost us a lot of lives, so we're going to punish you guys. And then it leads to evil. It leads to some of the Southlanders deciding to go and joining the orcs of all people.
So it's like we can chide the writers for thinking they're too clever, but they are pretty clever. Like there's some, or I'm thinking about in between watching this show and now I watched Black Adam, and I think that they could have borrowed a few of the writers from this show to try to fill out some of the the gaps in that story to make it make a little bit more sense. You know, like they could have gone over it one more. So yeah, as much as we want to take jabs at these guys, they did do some pretty interesting stuff. And in particular, this struggle with evil, the quest for redemption for this people, the way that some half of them join the orcs, the other half summon some courage to fight the orcs, is a very human story. The humans in this show are basically like humans in this world. Another basic analogy is the elves are kind of like guardian angels sent to help people, right? Like that's kind of on the nose. As much as Tolkien liked to describe himself as very veiled, it'd be like, well, the dwarves are kind of like exiled Jews. The elves are kind of like angels that are helping human beings. The human beings are struggling with being descendants of people who have rebelled against God and have taken the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and tried to rule this world their way instead of God's way. Things like that are woven into the show.
And similarly, we see it within the film, right? Within the films, we get that sort of story arc with Aragorn that, from what I understand, is not in the books so much, but they play up in the films that he's torn about his heritage. I'm a descendant of Isildur. Spoilers for Rings of Power. Isildur is hopefully still gonna do what he does in the movies, and drop the ball, basically. And so in this case, we have a first Adam, last Adam situation that's so clear, at least in the films, with Aragorn. And it seems like this. It really does seem like, kind of like what you said, Miles, with The Force Awakens. We've got a set of character types, we've got a set of themes, and they play with those throughout the setting of the Second Age. And I think that I get what they're going for, and generously it's fan fiction. I think that you're right, but overall the themes that they're playing with, I think, are still ring true in a lot of ways that are worth dialoguing about, and then worth watching Lord of the Rings again as sort of like a chaser.
I agree.
Cleanse the palate. Well, I mean, I really liked the conversation between Galadriel and Theo, right? Theo is a young person in the Southlands. He's kind of a symbol of somebody who's in the gap between good and evil, and he has this evil object that appears to be corrupting him a little bit, at least as a source of power, right? And he's learning what it means to be a human being. And Theo, is talking with Galadriel, and he's saying, like, it's good to kill orcs, which we're kind of in agreement with. But Galadriel rebukes him a little bit. She says, it darkens the heart to call dark deeds good. It gives place for evil to thrive inside of us. Every war is fought both within and without. And that reminds me of like all kinds of verses in Scripture. Like, give no opportunity to the devil. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. She's trying to equip him with both physical arms, physical weapons, as well as spiritual, to be able to reject that inside of you that starts to embrace darkness. Or similarly, what's a really good theme in shows and movies to illustrate this is how do you deal with revenge? And there's this phrase that gets repeated several times: you can't quench thirst by drinking seawater. And so the show at least tries to play with the themes of touching the darkness in your quest to be the light, and that line, touching the darkness to be able to understand the light, is said several times, even with multiple interpretations throughout the show, which is actually pretty clever.
Yeah, I think once they delivered on the, again, big spoiler warning here, on the reveal that Halbrand is Sauron, once they deliver on that, which I still have issues with, and we'll talk more about in a moment, that he says, what about it, sister? Touch the darkness once more, if you will.
Oh,
like,
that was. Okay, I thought that was a great line.
Yeah.
Okay, now I think we're getting to somewhere with that line, because I remember there's so much outrage when that episode aired, because people are like, what they're going for here. I'm like, well, first of all, let's finish the show, then let's see where they're going with it. But this line that you just read, Miles, about darkens the heart to call dark deeds good. I think that line reminds me, in sort of spirit, of Gandalf's line to Frodo, where Frodo says, it's a pity Bilbo didn't kill Gollum when he had the chance. It was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. Not all. Yeah, and he basically was describing, revenge. Are you able to give it to them? I mean, and this element, very, at least I guess spiritually, I guess you could say, is similar to what Galadriel was going for here. And overall, I think like that was one of the stronger lines and scenes in the story. That's why I'm very hesitant to say that it's all bad, because I think that it was a mixed bag in terms of where they went with some of the themes. But this concept of revenge, I mean, it really is fascinating once you get to the reveal of who Halbrand is, and
which I genuinely didn't see coming.
No,
I didn't see it coming, man. For most of the show, I got some inklings about an episode before the reveal that there was something going on with him. But really, it's like, good job, guys. You threw me off, and it also
worse,
that
right?
that line that made me bristle in the beginning of the show. They actually pushed back against the touching the darkness to be able to see the light in a way that I appreciate as a Christian, where you're like, no, not really. You don't have to touch the darkness to know the light. Light is what drives away the darkness, not the other way around.
Yeah. The light shined in the darkness. The darkness did not comprehend it.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's one of the interesting things. So I do different types of apologetics with atheists. I host a monthly get-together between Christian and atheists, and we talk about it. And one of the questions that's come up is the knowledge of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they asked the question of how could it have been wrong, or how could Eve or Adam known it was wrong to eat the fruit if they didn't have the knowledge? And so like that's where my mind goes when I hear these types of things of, to understand the light, you must first touch the darkness. I was like, no. Morality is not experiential. It's like morality is its thing.
I can't tell you how many times
that's where I push back with it. Where my mind goes, just because I've had these real life conversations with atheists who push back of going, well, how could God say it was wrong for them to do it? They were doing it out of innocence because they didn't have the knowledge of evil yet.
Yeah, and I think taking of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is very similar to all the times throughout Lord of the Rings where somebody chooses to use the ring even though they know it's evil.
Yes.
I think that's basically repeatedly that's what Tolkien is getting at least in part throughout all of these stories. Like one thing I appreciate about Isildur's arc in this show is that he's likable, he's growing, he's the hero that you appreciate, and that all of us know that, okay, as high as this guy goes, we're going to see his fall, which is kind of great, because the greater his character is, the more you and I realize that the best of us can be corrupted, right? The best of us are corrupt, right? And that's the show. That's what I mean. I like this show. I am a defender of it, man. It's it's a little. Go ahead.
I didn't have this in the notes because I don't want it to go too long, but knowing where Isildur ends up and backtracking it is what's the whole idea of like Breaking Bad. Like it doesn't just happen. It's like these small little things over time. Look at how Isildur behaves now. Like Numenor is a culture of service through guilds. And what has he been doing? He's been chasing an adventure. He goes from one guild, almost makes it, decides he doesn't want it, goes to another guild. And it's over and over and over. And his mind's constantly on this true Numenor, which I have no idea what that is.
Right. Yeah. I was hoping you could shed some light on that.
Okay. Yeah. It's not in the Tolkien lore, so I have no idea what it is. It's like,
dang it.
But yeah, it's like, to me, so you can see this character flaw of this, another great movie that you guys unfortunately said you wouldn't cover because it has some questionable content, The Green Knight. But one of the themes through it is true virtue, is going after virtue. It's kind of like the idea of, would you rather actually be virtuous or appear to be virtuous?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what that story, The Green Knight, kind of goes into, this faux virtue. And to me, that's where I started to see this in Isildur, especially in contrast to his father, Elendil.
Yeah.
Elendil was very much a service person. He was in service to his queen. He was in service to his country. He was going to go to Middle Earth and rescue the Southlanders because that's what the good and virtuous thing to do. Isildur wanted to come because he saw Galadriel and she's like, that girl's pretty cool. I'm going to follow her. Again, this is my cynicism coming out. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Miles.
One piece of motivation for Elendil that I liked is that he was like a masterful politician. He was basically saying, hey, there's some good free markets over there that we could open up. And if I do this for my country is going to really prosper if we succeed in this mission. It was interesting. He was so calm and collected, and he knew what he was going to do. Meanwhile, his son was. It's almost like Elendil is rebuking Isildur for not going to college. It's like, that's the kind of right, like bounced around like here I am.
Kind of. You're a dropout.
Yeah,
Isildur, come on.
And so I think there's a lot to go from there, and I think that they're laying some foundations for some good things in the future with that arc. Or another thing to change gears a little bit, an interesting theme about the corruption of evil and redemption, something that this show opened up that is genuinely new in Tolkien lore, and especially to the Peter Jackson movies, is just this question of, can the orcs be redeemed? Right. So there's if the elves are angels, the orcs are basically kind of demonic, right? Demonic. So you have like Adar, who a lot of us probably thought was Sauron for a lot of the show, right? He has this thing. The orcs are just as worthy of a home. There have been many lies that to undo all of them would require remaking the world.
Yeah, I was so that was my note. I love that line. There have been many lies that to undo all of them would require remaking the world. And I knew ahead of time what was going on because I had seen the spoilers and stuff like that. So I was like, oh well, this is kind of foreshadowing that the Southlands is going to turn into Mordor. But I just love that lie because that line because it is very applicable to our life. Honestly, it's like, so think about our life before we were redeemed and after. it is this switch. It's like what we believed pre redemption or pre justification, I should say, is completely opposite now of what now we believe and what we know. It's like our entire world has been remade in this in that sense. We view the world completely differently now we view it from perspective of Christ instead of our own perspective. So we literally have to undo the entire world to now start living as a Christian. But going to Tolkien's world, not living in our world, but Tolkien's world, is the orcs were not children of Iluvatar. And Iluvatar is, again, Tolkien has an incredible mythology, but there is one god. His world is theistic. There's one god that created everything. And that's Iluvatar. He created elves. He created men. He did not create dwarves, which is kind of an interesting thing. But he created all these, these other things. Orcs are a corruption of, his children and his design. So when Adar is funny that when Adar says there are many lies, he then follows up with a lie by saying orcs are children of Iluvatar.
Yeah.
When they're not. They're not. And so it's funny. It's like, and it's a very way Satan does it. He goes, he affirms that there's many lies out there, but then he lies to you about what lies, to believe or not believe or to get rid of. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that Adar was, they call him an orc, like an orc, a perversion. He says, no, Uruk, right? He's like trying to add some dignity. He didn't know exactly where he was at that time. That genuinely was interesting that this is the first time that we are given a sympathetic view of the orc's point of view in Lord of the Rings, which was just again kind of a betrayal of the mythos, but interesting.
Well, I was curious about that as well because I had heard something on a podcast, and I admittedly should have done more homework before blurting it out on this podcast. But where there was discussion with the Tolkien expert about the that element, is because there was apparently some disagreement in the Tolkien lore surrounding the origin of the orcs. We get one sort of, because from what I gather, Tolkien changed his mind throughout his life about where the orcs came from. And one of the stories, and I forget what the other one is, but one of the stories is what we get in Lord of the Rings. What Saruman tells the leader of the Uruk-hai, you were once elves that were tortured and blah, 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 and perverted in these ways. But the element there, and then there was another direction of it to go. And so I was curious, Eric, if you had any insight on that, because there seemed to be a little lack of clarity, similarly to where there's some mystery in the Lord of the Rings lore, of like the Entwives, for example. They don't really know what happened to them. It's never really explained. But in this case, there's actually a little discrepancy.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you want to think about it, Tolkien only published 2 Lord of the Rings things himself: The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The Silmarillion was done after he passed, and Christopher had taken over everything and organized everything. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure. And so there was always debates back and forth between Christopher and his dad about what is the original story, which one is it. So essentially, Christopher, when he published the Silmarillion, basically went with more of the idea of, no, elves are, orcs are corrupted elves. Is that's what it is? It's like evil cannot, and it's actually not a Tolkien quote, but it's been being thrown around. But it's like, evil cannot create; it can only pervert, essentially. Pervert and scar, if you want to put it that way.
Which I think is a very Christian concept, right? Because a lot of people be like, oh, there's good and evil. God needed the devil because it's balancing light and dark. No, God is light, and darkness can be the absence of light. And I think basically in Lord of the Rings, like we've talked about this, I think off camera, that Lord of the Rings, it presents simplistic evil, and that's okay for this story, right? Is that these are corrupted elves, right? If the elves are kind of an angelic figure, these are kind of demonic figure. I mean, they burn up in the sun. They're like vampires, right? That's like I like vampires for a symbol of evil and corruption. Like John 3:20 says, "For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works be exposed." Right? That's a biblical thing. Creatures of darkness.
Well, and you see that too with how the home that they want. Orcs are just as worthy of a home. And how do they get their home? By destroying a beautiful mountain. Spreading ash all over the place, getting a lot of people, killed in the process. And now orcs have a home. Yeah. And it's all built on death and destruction. Matter of fact, there is in the Lord of the Rings, the 2 towers, I believe it is. Sam has the one ring on, and he's following a group of orcs. And these 2 orcs, from 2 different companies, they're talking. And they're talking about, after the war, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get a couple, good guys, create a little posse, and we'll just go about the world, just, pillaging and, doing all the kind of orc stuff. And it's the same stuff that you would have if it wasn't orcs. That type of banter between 2 army officials talking about, after the war's over, I'm going to get a boat. I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to do this. But the orcs' nature is, hey, I'm going to get a good group of guys together, some guys I can trust, and we're just going to go kill some people because it's going to be fun. It's they're like that. That is.
What are you going to do after the war? Oh, rape and pillage. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just looking forward to putting my feet up. It's really going to be relaxing to only have to kill on my own schedule. I want to be self-employed, for goodness sake. I get my own ship. And it's funny because the whole building of the Southland, it's like, I gotta be honest, I was a little dumb, if you will, on this, because upon rewatch, I was like, those mountains, I should have known this was going to be Mordor this whole time. I feel so stupid because especially because they show us, and I felt so dumb because then they show it's not a sigil, it's a map. And I'm like, that's the mountain ranges around Mordor. Oh, I'm so dumb. Yeah. And then when they do Mount Doom, so the geologist in me, who apparently not very observant geologist in me, was very frustrated by how they did Mount Doom. Like, I thought it was kind of neat. You get to see volcanic eruption, you get to see lava bombs and ash, and that was neat. But the concept that this mountain just exists as a dormant volcano with this huge cavernous empty space inside with stalactites and stalagmites and a pool of lava, literally the floor is lava. And then this water drops in, and that's how the volcanic eruption occurs. I'm like, what? So in the same way that Eric was like appalled at some of the story beats here because of what he knows about Tolkien, that's how I was about the geology of this show. I'm like, no, that's not what happens when you put what?
And I'm here sitting like,
it was just driving me nuts.
Ignorance is bliss. I like it. This is narratively, it works. The themes work well.
If anything, it would have killed the volcano.
Yeah.
If anything.
Maybe it's evil mystical water or something. But
exactly.
But in the end, there's like a land for the orcs. You know, the orcs are basically like demons, right? Biblically speaking, the judgment for demons, Satan, sin, and demons and death is eternal fire, right? Hell, Hades are going to be thrown into the lake of fire. Jesus even talks about it, right? Depart from me to the eternal fire prepared for devil and his angels. And so similar to the biblical concept, this show is saying, dear audience, you shouldn't relate to the orcs. You should relate to humans and halflings and dwarves and elves being tempted or intimidated or corrupted by evil, sometimes resisting and having the courage to stay pure. So there's that whole story arc, the theme, the struggle with evil, the struggle for redemption that doesn't really belong to the orcs. But even then, the narrative of the show kind of undermines that, right? Because Adar is kind of he's kind of a perversion of a perversion, because the real evil in the show sees Adar as evil, right?
Exactly. So the relationship between Adar and Halbrand, I was so confused because, all right, so the reveal happens that Halbrand, spoilers again, is Sauron.
Wow.
And I'm just like, wait, okay, that's weird, because I thought Sauron, Eric, please correct me if I'm wrong, isn't Sauron a wizard?
No.
Okay.
Sauron, the wizards, all the wizards, and Balrogs, and a couple other things in the world are all the same, essentially angels. They're essentially like lower gods that have free will, and they're able to go about, do their stuff. Technically, and this is another cool thing if you want to think about it visually. So you have the Balrog, which is a fire Maiar. That's what they're called, Maiars.
Okay,
It's a Maiar. It's a class of being, and that's what Gandalf, Sauron, Balrogs are. Balrogs are described as dark fire Maiars. The sun is also a Maiar, but think good Balrog. It's a fire Maiar. So it's kind of like, you want to just think visually, is like
stars, planets,
cool
things
is.
Like that for mythos that fits, right? How would ancient people in Britain see the stars, sun, moon, and stars and things?
That's interesting. And so basically what you're saying then is that Sauron is not quite a wizard, but he's kind of he's a Maiar.
Or think about this
in the same.
Yeah.
Think about the same way the wizards are Maiar. He's a Maiar, but he's not a wizard. Okay.
Think about the way
a degree of immortality, if you will, that the wizards have.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so think about the kind of three evil wizards that appear, and they find the stranger, and they think that he's Sauron. Right? So why would they think that? Because essentially they're the same type of being. Yep. Is what at least the show's communicating. Yeah. I don't have the history that Eric does.
Were they wizards?
I don't know. Probably in the colloquial sense, but not in the technical sense.
They were Maiars, I guess.
I don't know.
Were they based in because they named them in the subtitles? They called them the Sojourner, the something. They had names, and I was like, "That's weird," because they never mentioned the names. So that makes me think that they may have been based on something in the books. But we got questions.
I think basically
they were not based on anything in the books.
I think that the stranger just needs some people to fight. I think that's basically why they exist. Because the Maiar are this particular category which the show seems to be keeping. They're above elves, right? Lower than the god, but above the elves. Even if we use elves as kind of an analogy for angels, it's like they're a level much higher up in that sense,
like an archangel or something.
But in the end,
maybe
like Halbrand and Adar are enemies, even though they seem from our perspective to be the same. Sauron and Adar are enemies.
And so that makes sense of Halbrand being able to, of Sauron being able to shapeshift, because I guess that's what must have happened. Is that
Yes.
he was much taller as Sauron. They show that even in this, he's substantially tall. Aren't you a little short to be Sauron?
So
If you
it's
will.
kind of one of the interesting things about how power isn't unlimited in Tolkien's world. So as you use your power, it diminishes you. Everything has has a cost. So one of the things that ends up happening is after the forging of all of the rings. Again, all the stories out of order and everything like that. But essentially, Sauron gets willfully captured by the Númenóreans. He's taken to Númenor. He corrupts the minds of those around him, convinces them to sail off and go to war against the gods, essentially. And that's the gods then destroy Númenor in retaliation, destroying, and in the process, destroying Sauron's body. And so but his spirit still, lives, and his spirit went back to Middle Earth. This is all pre Lord of the Rings. His body went back to Middle Earth because that's where the One Ring was, and he's able to essentially regenerate himself. But he was never, from that point on, he was never again able to. This is not Tolkien's word, but I'll use it. He was never able again to appear as an angel of light. If you want to think about it that way. But he's always been a shapeshifter. In the Lord of the Rings, he was in the Silmarillion. He appears multiple times, once as a vampire, another time as a werewolf.
And in the Hobbit movies, they show him kind of as a.
I know the Silmarillion is so much better than anything that's ever been produced.
Like even in the Hobbit, he appears kind of as a necromancer, which is similar but different. You know? But in this show, what does he appear as? As a false messiah. Right, a false reluctant king, basically, kind of in the pattern of what Aragorn will be in the future, right? That there's this promised king. Yes, and so that it was this really the deception of evil was a really interesting theme in the show, and because I took it my notes midway through the show were, wow, Halbrand is like a returning king. Psalm 2, the promised Messiah, all throughout Scripture, all of this stuff. He's this guy. This is a cool theme that I like. And then by the end, you go, oh, he's a false Messiah. That is so interesting.
Well, it is interesting, and I was really confused by a lot of it, because if we're meant to believe, and we don't have to go too far down this trail, but I have questions basically. And so if Adar is telling the truth that Adar killed Sauron, right, which is what we're led to believe is presumably the truth, because we never get a counter story that corrects that. We know that Sauron is mad at Adar about something, but he never tells us what. We're led to believe it's that he surrendered to Morgoth, but that's not what it was. Presumably it's because Adar killed him. Adar then does not recognize him and is confused by him. Who are you? And we're all like, yeah, who are you? And they never explain that. So does that mean that he is a shapeshifter? And because that could add up.
I think so.
He haps into her mind, and in a way that a wizard might, presumably, or a Maiar in this case. I don't know. I just thought that was really odd that Halbrand and Adar had that background, but I was just really baffled by it. And then additionally, that Halbrand, I'm wondering how much of this was genuine when he's like, I wanted to be left alone. I wanted to stay in Númenor, and you brought me along here. You kind of reluctantly dragged me along. And so basically my question is this: if Galadriel had not prompted him along, is it possible that Sauron would have just kind of like gone in this story, again, not in the Lord of the Rings lore, that he would have just kind of gone his own way and enjoyed making swords and whatnot and doing his own thing and not tried to conquer the whole planet? Like, do we really have Galadriel to thank for all of this? That's kind of what they don't really wrap up very clearly, I don't think, in the story. I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Or I guess season 2 might explain some of it, but I don't know.
I think they're trying to say that, but it just doesn't seem to fit quite right. I think it was just trying to add an extra bit of tension for Galadriel to have some of that deception. But the guy obviously had his plans, and one of the themes. Mm-hmm. So like we'll get to this a little bit later, but the final episode is called Alloyed, where there's a principle of metal in that maybe we shouldn't force these things together. We have to kind of ease them together. And so Halbrand has just been playing a game of deception and intrigue, and looking like he's being the one being pulled along by Galadriel, but really he's been pulling strings from all different directions. That's at least the way I take it, but it isn't totally easy to see exactly what was going on. But that's one of the things I kind of like about it, is that I was genuinely thrown. And normally I see twists of the show coming a mile away. This one, I didn't.
I think this really could have done with like a couple of scenes of either flashbacks or at least some exposition of him saying like, you thought that you got on that raft. You know, basically you thought that you randomly found us in the ocean when really I'm the one who found you. Like if there had been some, basically,
well, I like her.
A different movie. Now there was no Kaiser Sose moment.
Yes.
If you will.
Yes.
You know, there was no like, oh my gosh, I get it all. There was no Kaiser Sose moment. And if the Usual Suspects reference, if you don't know what that means. And that to me was like, that's why I'm really lost on whether I liked that reveal, because it was just kind of clunky. It wasn't.
I think he had it
as it could have been.
I think he's like,
think so?
She's like, you rode with me. We fought against Adar and the orcs, and he's like, fought against my enemies. And that's what connected two story arcs were connected to me in that one line is, oh, okay, so Adar really is a semi-sympathetic character who has some habits of the elves, like he plants the seeds before the battle and things like that. And Sauron was like,
Sauron's gauntlet.
this guy is in my way. I'm going to use him to, I like Mordor. I'll keep Mordor, but I'm going to kill Adar, you know, that kind of thing. You go, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, and then all of this was, I think
there was not as much manipulation as I would have expected for Sauron, because they built up Sauron this whole time. That's the thing. He never landed to the point where I believed emotionally while watching it. Oh my gosh, that's Sauron. I'm just kind of like, okay.
Yeah, it seems to be mostly to support Galadriel's arc in the show. Seems to be the way it was constructed.
Yeah. For sure. Anyway, I'm sorry for all the tangents. I was like,
no, it was a big question.
I feel like having Eric here was, yeah, exactly. Having a little insight into anything that might have been, you know, revealed from the books. And in this case, it's all, you know, we're pretty well off the rails there. But anyway, so in this case, like you mentioned, this reluctant leader theme is one of the ones that they played with from Lord of the Rings, and they bring back with Halbrand. And in this case, it's the deception. And so you're right, Miles. I think that there is some cleverness to it. I just think that basically, there might be a draft of this or an edit of this that is better executed, you know, in terms of what it's attempting to do.
Yeah, I think instead of Halbrand being Sauron, Halbrand should have been one of the kings that eventually has one of the 9 rings. It's like, so create separate stories. Like, make Sauron the unknown big bad, because we know he can shapeshift. We know he's a great deceiver. Keep us guessing who it is. Yeah. For 2 seasons, but build up these other characters, and we get to see their downfall. Their downfalls, instead of just Halbrand, build them up to be, a reluctant leader, Aragorn 2.0, or since it's in the past, the original Aragorn. Build them up and then show that no, even this king fell. And this is why we need the true Aragorn. And so I'll skip it for time, but recommend all of the listeners to just go and read Aragorn's arrival. Unfortunately, I don't have the page number in the book, but it's in the chapter of the Pelennor Fields. It's the big battle. The movie doesn't do it justice, but when Aragorn arrives and his ship, and the moment of hope, and then the moment of despair for the enemies of the king, is one of the greatest. I mean, I love it so much. And then go and read Revelation 21 through 22 and the full hope. As I read both of those back to back, and it's wonderful.
Oh man, it's great. Wow. And like that kind of ties into like one of the next themes I really liked in this show is how to deal with your own failure. So like Aragorn calls on these failed human beings to fulfill their oath, right? And this show tries to touch on how do you deal with your own failure. So like there's this big army that's raised for several episodes, and they come to redeem the Southland to stop the orcs, and they fail. Right. Mm-hmm. And like Theo feels guilty because he gave up the hilt of power. Wink, wink. It's trying to be, and Galadriel failed because it's been her
The
mission the whole
MacGuffin
time.
of power.
The MacGuffin of power. And I just, oh man, I love this theme so much, where Galadriel is comforting Theo, and she says, "There are powers beyond darkness at work in this world. Perhaps on days such as this, we have little choice but to trust in their design and surrender our own." Or similarly, Queen Mirian from Numenor says, my father said, "The way of the faithful is committing to pay the price, even if the cost may not be known, trusting that in the end it will be worth it." Right? There are times where it's difficult to trust, but this show advocates for trust in providence and sovereignty of the God of this world. This is the biggest budget Amazon produced show of the world, right? Like a big cash grab, especially in the cynical part of Eric's heart. But what is the show? What is one of the big show's biggest lesson? Trust in the providence and sovereignty of Iluvatar. Trust in the providence or sovereignty of God and how that He orchestrated events in order for people to achieve goodness and redemption in this world. I was like, holy cow! I can't believe that that's in this show.
Yeah,
It's so cool.
I know that was one of the themes that's throughout all of Tolkien. That's like one of the themes that they actually got right, honestly. And it's been this big debate back and forth, mostly among Catholics and Reformed Protestants, about this Tolkien's idea of predestination, essentially, or this trust in this sovereign power. One of the lines in this that Durin the Elder, I forget which number he is, but Durin the Elder,
Oh yeah,
he says to
Durin,
the younger Durin the Younger, the elves' fate has been decided by I don't know if he says beings or by those much wiser and and powerful than us.
Yeah.
And it's like this idea of destiny, of fate, of sovereignty, of a higher being does run through the entire thing. And again, going back to the old sayings, like image bearers are going to image bear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. That blew me away because there was so much concern going into this about, again, quote, woke themes. And what stood out to me is that there were some lines, that each, and they made their way into the trailers mostly. The advertisements really played up. Each one of you, and Muriel speaking to the Numenorians, must decide, who you are going to be. Nori says to the stranger, he says, "They told me who I am." And she said, "Only you get to decide who you are." Those sort of really modern concepts of deciding who you are the elements of the story that fell flat and that didn't really make sense, because ultimately he didn't get to decide that he was good. He was good. That wasn't up to him, though. The stranger, Gandalf, quote, is not. It's not really up to him. He didn't get to decide. It's not like if he had willed it, he could have become Sauron. No, he was not Sauron. They were just stupid. I don't know how you missed that, guys. You forgot that there was other beings here. But like, in this case, the elements that actually, like you said, landed well are the ones that, despite being smothered in many ways narratively, made their way through from Tolkien's writing, made their way through being the writers of this story as being image bearers of God. They made their way through, kind of like a flower growing up through a crack in the sidewalk. They made their way. So to me, that was pretty cool. That was pretty redeeming in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Again, it's why I like this show. And I'm going to defend against the haters, even though I'm trying to understand the haters, right? It's just like, it really is genuinely great that trust in the providence of the God of the world of Middle Earth is a theme that this show really hits on. It's like in the Return of the King, when Gandalf says, it comforts me to know that Bilbo was supposed to find the ring. And whatever worldview, whatever system of theology you use to wrestle with God's sovereignty and human beings' choices, there is that where inside the story, it's, you need to choose what's going on. Whatever worldview people use to interpret that, but in the end, Calvinists and Arminians, unless maybe you're an open theist, that might be outside of the thing, understand that they're predestinarian, right? They trust in the providence of God, who will end up setting things right, that there's a happy ending, or that they trust in the words of Tolkien. One of his greatest works, when he actually explains his thought, is on fairy stories, where he talks about the catastrophe, And so we think of catastrophe in a negative sense, but he taught me a new phrase, the eucatastrophe. Catastrophe is just the word for something that is suddenly changed in a story. So, a catastrophe in the middle of the show is they lose the battle and Southlands get turned into Mordor. And it's hard to believe in the good catastrophe, the eucatastrophe, when your land has just been turned into Mordor, your queen has been blinded, you feel like you've failed. It was your mistakes that led to this terrible thing that happened, right? And you're just down, you're in the pit, life under the sun, despair. But there's this trust in the good catastrophe to come ahead. There's a good sudden change. And every good story has little ones of those, where the hero is like on their back dodging blows from the evil orc and they're about to die, and then an arrow shoots the orc and they fall over. Tiny good eucatastrophe. All of those that point to the greater good news that there's going to be a good sudden change in this world. And this show at times made me feel that way. Like, in that sense, it captured one of the biggest themes in Tolkien's work that I think is useful for a popcorn theology type discussion.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like you said, getting that moment, I think there were some really well executed battle scenes that captured that element well. And even, to that end, as much as it bugs me narratively that everything arrived timing wise the way that they did, when the when the Númenóreans roll in and save the Southlands, there's an element of like, yeah, that's cool. As frustrated as I was, it was like, well, that was quick and convenient.
Well, it was.
Didn't you say it was a day's ride? Didn't you? Like, you could have not said that, but it's like.
And it was trying to be the charge on Helm's Deep coming in from the east, where at least in Helm's Deep they were barricaded in for a night,
Yeah,
but it's
exactly.
It's trying to eucatastrophe over and over again in Tolkien's work, trying to throw that into this story. Right, could have been executed a little better. Still pretty cool in my opinion. Ignorance.
Honestly, it would just take some editing. It would just take some editing to make that better executed. But I agree that I liked a lot of that. That you have they fought through the night. Arendir, I think is how you say it.
Yeah, I don't know. That's what I've been trying.
Some good execution of some of the battle scenes.
Oh yeah, they had like a Daredevil style long cut with that fight with the orc. Did you guys see that? It felt a little out of place in Lord of the Rings, but it was a cool scene.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, a little Daredevil-esque. Yeah, for sure.
And to kind of to wind down in this episode, I swear we're getting to it. In the end, we've already talked about the final reveal, but the hidden deceit and the power of the unseen world all wrapped up in the Hellbrand reveal, I thought was a pretty cool picture of evil in our world, right? I think Eric already referenced this. In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul writes, "And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond with their deeds." So he said, look, the devil will appear as an angel of light. His servants will do something similar. And so even while we struggle in ourselves with the evil in our own hearts, whether I'm good or I'm evil, or whether somebody we're interacting with is good or evil, this show kind of speaks to that. Like when there was at the end of, I think, episode 7, when they say that the stranger is Sauron, that broke my heart. I was like, oh man, this is really sad. I don't want the stranger to be Sauron. That was a good twist in one direction. And then there's this whole conversation about whether you're good or whether you're peril.
Yeah.
But in the end,
that was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was on board with, a lot of people have given those lines a hard time, like, oh, I'm good. And it's like, I mean, the guy's got his bell rung. I mean, I'm basically viewing it as a concussion, like a really bad magic concussion. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know what's going on. He's got kind of like soap opera-esque amnesia, and he's got to figure that out yet.
Yeah.
And, I thought that was good because, I mean, we'll throw James a bone. He's not on this episode, but back in our previous episode on this, he was speculating that it was Gandalf. And I think he was right because they didn't say, oh, look, it's Gandalf or it's Mithrandir or it's one of his other names. But they gave him a line that he says later. It was a little nod and a wink. So we get that. Yeah. The Toucan Sam, follow your nose sort of deal. Brought to you by Fruit Loops. But But I thought that was okay. I liked that it was him. It makes more sense than what I thought they might do is make it Saruman, because in
Yeah.
the case of Saruman, we have a being who spent, I think, as I understand from the books, a few hundred years being good before then becoming peril. So, like, I would almost have been fascinated if it had been Saruman, but it would have been really sad. And so it kind of had to be Gandalf if we were going to have any like rewarding payoff to that character, for
Yeah.
sure. And so, in terms of that, in terms of the, this element of the power of the unseen world, I thought that was fascinating, because this unseen world element, I mean, really, they toy with that so much in this season, and we would acknowledge as Christians this is something that we can maybe at least redeem, if not receive, that there is an unseen world.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly a fair bit that we can reject from this story, but the unseen element of it is something that gets closer to receive.
Yeah,
if not,
and the unseen
redeem, if
realm
not
is
receive.
deceptive and seductive. Like I preached a sermon on Halloween a couple weeks ago, just about the concept of Halloween, how Christians should generally view the spiritual world. And in research for that, I was listening to these people who did this deliverance ministry, and this gal who said that apparently they were dealing with spirits who were asking human beings like, "We want to be redeemed too." And then her ministry just crumbled underneath her under this, and she believes that there were spiritual beings deceiving her, pretending to be like kind of like, it's funny, kind of like Halbrand here, pretending to be somebody in need of help when really they were trying to deceive and bring somebody down. Now, I don't know, again, take with a grain of salt somebody's story, but it fits, right? It fits the deceptive
Sure.
idea of evil, where in like I loved the last episode. It's called Alloyed. The metal shouldn't be forced to bond, but drawn or coaxed. And so this unseen evil, this hidden or deceptive evil, is coaxing all these people who are trying to struggle against evil, struggling with their own evil, into doing something to their own devices. And that is a really interesting story, in my opinion.
Yeah, what you're saying definitely makes sense. So towards the end there, when after the reveal and Sauron and Galadriel are having their conversation, and Galadriel says to him, "It's like, you'd make me a tyrant," and he says back to her, "I'd make you a queen, fair as the sun, stronger than the foundations of the earth." And again, that goes back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier. The sin of Eve, all the way back in Genesis. He's tempting her to see the good she could achieve with his power by his side as a queen. Jesus's temptation in the wilderness with Satan saying, "Hey, just bow to me. You don't have to go to the cross. I'll give you all the kingdoms. I'm the master of this world right now. Bow to me. All the kingdoms are yours. You don't have to do this cross thing." And it's that same temptation that Eve faced, back in the garden and failed, that Jesus faced and succeeded. And in this story, that Galadriel faced. And she actually technically faces it twice.
Yeah.
Right.
Once in this story, again, directly with Sauron, and then in the Lord of the Rings as the proxy, the actual one ring, to be the actual power, not to be the queen on the arm of the tyrant, but to be the queen, to be in charge of it all, just yourself.
Yeah. I got to tell you, that scene in the Fellowship of the Ring the first time, when I was a kid, I was like, what is this? It confused me.
Comes out
it
of
scared
nowhere.
me. But it turns out
yeah.
that it's the point of the story, right? That even Boromir, he has the noble desire. I just want to protect my homeland. It's all I've ever lived for. And it causes him to betray a friend. Galadriel is tempted to become this tyrant of a queen. But in this show, right, it shows that she's the same character. It's the beginning of the seed of her being able to resist the temptation of the ring. No, I won't be the queen on your arm. Which, again, let's do our Jesus juke. Reminds us of Jesus, who is the one who resists. He resists the devil's temptation better than anybody else, right? Unlike the Harfoots, he's the friend who helps, without leaving you behind with a broken back. Doesn't tell you to get in the back, so that because I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you. He transforms us into people who help each other. He doesn't leave the weak behind. He passes the test, and And he is also, not only is he the rescue, he's also the one who trusts in the providence of his father, trusts in the providence of God, and doesn't choose the corrupt means to achieve his kingdom, unlike we do all the time. And so in this show, image bearers are going to bear image. Some of them exemplify aspects of Christ in the Christian life. Some of them exemplify the God-shaped hole and the gap that we need. But this show did an okay job at grasping something a little bit higher. And as much as Tolkien might be rolling over in their grave, Tolkien truists might be having a hard time. It was good for me. Ignorance is bliss. I like this show, man.
I feel like similarly, I kind of had a sort of Joey-esque moment from Friends, where they're eating the gross dessert that Rachel makes, and he's like, I like it.
Yeah.
Elves good.
Yeah.
Dwarves good. Kind of thing.
Theme's good.
I felt like theme's good. Execution, that I had a similar feel there, and it's funny because normally we tend to land fairly close to one another on the stuff that we cover, but on this one we all had slightly different takes. Miles was a lot more optimistic.
Yeah, I'm so positive on this thing.
Positive. Eric, was allowed to be cynical on this. We appreciate it, and honestly, like the more I've thought about it, the more I've been like, I don't know. Like it could have been so much better than it was, and I'm disappointed that it wasn't better.
We're the angel and the demon on your shoulder going back and forth right now.
That's right. You guys are
battle for the soul of David. Don't be too salty. Don't call dark deeds good. Embrace the light, David.
And honestly, there's an element to my personality that is definitely leans more towards, everyone says that they hate it, well, I'm probably going to love it. Oh, everyone says that they love it, well, I'm probably going to hate it. Like that's not a good thing. It's just
being kind of
something happened in
country.
Yeah.
And on the bright side, that you have many more seasons to enjoy or to hate in the future, because I don't know if you noticed that this show is all about the creation of the 3 rings for the elves. And so if you know, like a very famous statement in The Lord of the Rings, I think Eric knows this one.
3 rings for the elven kings under the sky. 7 for the dwarf lords and their halls of stone. 9 for mortal men doomed to die. 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all. 1 ring to find them. 1 ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them. In the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie.
Okay, so this show established the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie, and if you notice, the what plays in the credits of this show is a song that is this statement. And season 1 is 3 rings for the elves and Mordor constructed. Right, that's what this is.
And if I'm not mistaken, they never say the word ring. Maybe if they do, it's very, very rare. They try hard not to say rings. We're making rings, guys.
But they say it has to be circular, so that way the light can bend in on itself and continuous. I don't know. He defeated entropy. That's what he did.
It's kind of like in the Spider-Man reboots.
He made an arc reactor, basically. Yeah.
Palladium in the chest. It's kind of like when they're trying not to say with great power comes great responsibility in all the Spider-Man reboots. But there are more rings to come, and we'll see if we're more positive or negative on it.
Do you guys think that they're going to do like 1 season per? Like the next season will end with the 7 rings for the Dwarf Lords or something like that? I mean,
I think so.
I don't know. I liked Eric's idea of having Halbrand instead be, and I thought they were going for this for a while, the Witch King of Angmar. I was like, ooh, okay, all right, that could have been interesting because he's the leader of the Nazgul. That would have been really cool and long term, something they could have delivered on. I agree. I think that would have been a better choice than making him Sauron. But it's something that they could still introduce that character. Maybe that's somebody else that we've seen already. That's going to be relevant.
But we didn't
I'm
even
looking
get
forward to seeing more dwarves, if nothing else.
Yeah, more dwarves in their glory, and we didn't even get to talk too much about Celebrimbor and the way that Halbrand had been deceiving him. We won't get into that because we are wrapping up all these kind of things. There's more to discuss about this show, and probably we'll bring it up when the next few seasons come around, and maybe by then, Popcorn Theologians, patron saints, you might be able to work your way onto the show. You can't force it, but you might be able to alloy it. You might be drawn or coaxed into taking over the podcast.
For sure. I feel like if by the next one it's just like all patron saints and none of the OG left, I'm going to be a little worried. But at this point, I'm just outnumbered. But that's okay. It's all good. I appreciate it, you guys. And honestly, Eric, thanks so much for joining us, man. This is the kind of thing that is so much fun with movies that you love and shows that you love. But like it's a challenge with something that you didn't enjoy. And I can speak from experience. 276 episodes in, I have not loved everything that we have covered. That has just been the case. And so I appreciate your willingness to join us on this and share and honestly teach us. I've been pestering you with questions, and it's been a great time. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been really enjoyable.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we should probably wrap this up. Nice lengthy episode, but that's good. Go check out the Lord of the Rings episodes. Again, if you want a good chaser for this, watch Lord of the Rings and listen to those episodes. They're somewhere in the 60s, I think. And yeah, like we were saying earlier, share this episode on social media with your friends, with whoever it is that, share it with your enemies. I don't know. Share it with people that are talking about this content. Rate and review the podcast if you're interested. Consider supporting us on Patreon for just $1 a month. That allows you to be part of the community and to vote on future episodes. Consider buying merchandise for the popcorn theologians in your life for Christmas coming up, and all of that fun stuff. And wherever it is that you have these conversations, keep doing that. Keep it going. Keep engaging media from a godly worldview. And remember, you are not a mindless consumer.
3 rings for the elven kings under the sky. 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone. 9 for more